So we're in our series called The World of the Bible, and tonight's teaching is not something I would do on a Sunday morning. So we're going to get a little bit in the weeds here, so to speak. And I'd like us to talk about the practice of polygamy in the ancient world, the practice of men having more than one wife. And before we get into some of the details, I want to begin by making one thing very clear, which is that God's original plan for mankind when it came to marriage was always monogamy. Polygamy, many wives; monogamy, one wife. And that goes way back to Genesis 1. In the very beginnings of the existence of human beings, it says in verse 24, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." So even in the grammar there, and I looked it up in Hebrew to make sure it's a good translation, it appears in the singular, hold fast to his wife, one person, they shall become one flesh. So that was God's original plan for marriage. And thousands of years later, Jesus emphasized this idea. There was a group of Pharisees that came to him, and they began to test him. And they asked him what he thought about the Old Testament laws, the law of Moses concerning divorce. And Jesus quoted this text in Genesis. And then he said, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." So Jesus reaffirmed it, that it was God's plan from the beginning that a marriage would be one man and one woman. And so we know what God wanted from the beginning, but you don't have to read very far into the Old Testament. I think it's around chapter 4 of Genesis where you see the first example of polygamy. I'm pretty sure it's about that, right in that area. And as you begin to study Israel's history, you find not only did polygamy exist, but it was accepted as a normal behavior. It was very widespread. There wasn't any social stigma. There wasn't any criticism toward those who practiced it. And so what I want to talk about tonight are some of the reasons that this happened. And the reason is I think it'll help us to better understand why God, and I'll use the word allowed or tolerated, why God allowed the practice of something that he never wanted. And I'm going to give you some social reasons it happened. And then at the end, I'm going to get into something that is going to, I'll admit it's going to be speculation. And so you're going to have to think about it. Don't accept it as true just because I'm saying it. But I'm going to suggest something to you which will hopefully inform our discussion. And then one more thing, I am not going to do justice to this subject tonight. There's way too much material. So depending on how discussion goes, we might come back next week and we might have some more on this subject. We'll just see. It depends on how you guys respond. So one of the reasons that in the Bible, in the Old Testament, we see polygamy taking place had to do with kings. And it had to do with kings in Israel, beginning with Solomon here, using marriage to form alliances with the kings of other nations. So the book of 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1 mentions this. It said, Solomon made a marriage alliance, that's the phrase, with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. How? He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David, that's Jerusalem, until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. So now why would that happen? Well, in that day, this was actually a pretty common practice. Kings typically had lots of children, and one of the things they would do, they would allow one of their daughters to marry a king of another country as a way to prevent war. So in this case, for example, this was essentially a guarantee that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, would not attack Israel because his daughter was now married to Solomon and she's living in Israel. And so if the Egyptian army attacked Israel, they would put Pharaoh's daughter at risk. So you see the logic there. It was a way of guaranteeing a peaceful alliance between two countries. And this was actually, this idea of forming political alliances through marriage, that wasn't something that Solomon just did one time with the daughter of Pharaoh. he did this throughout his life. 1 Kings 11, the first part of verse 3, says he had 700 wives who were princesses. Interesting, right? These weren't just random Jewish women he met that he fell in love with. These were princesses, meaning they were the daughters of kings, and the reason that he married them, those were political marriages, again, to establish an alliance between Israel and whatever country that king's daughter came from. But of course, you know the story, right? At least most of you do, I'm sure, that all of these unbelieving wives, and when I say unbelieving, I'm talking about non-Jewish women who worshiped the gods and the idols of their homeland, all of these unbelieving wives coming into his life over time had a very negative spiritual effect on Solomon. So let's stay in verse 3. He had 700 wives who were princesses, 300 concubines, and we'll come back to that in a second. And his wives turned away his heart. Verse 4, for when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. And if you go back to Deuteronomy 17, God had been speaking to the people of Israel, and he had basically said to them, someday you're going to want a king. And even though God didn't want them to have a king, God knew what they were going to do, and he warned them, even before they had a king, many years before, this is what's going to happen. Deuteronomy 17, the first part of verse 17, he, and he's talking about the future king, shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. And so Solomon was not supposed to do what he did, and yet he did it, and exactly as God had said, his heart was turned away from serving the Lord. Then there was a second reason for polygamy in Israel, and really not just Israel, any nation would have had this in that time of history. It was simply that some men wanted more than one woman. And these are generally men who they might not have been very wealthy, but they would have had to have had some financial means to support more than one family. And so they wanted to have more than one woman. So oftentimes it would be a second wife. And then what they would also do is they would have concubines, which is a really unusual word, right? It's all throughout the Old Testament. And essentially, a concubine is a word that describes a woman who functioned as the wife of a man, but she didn't have the full legal status that a wife would have. Now, she was legally protected. He had to provide for her needs, in other words, housing and food and things like that. And any children that she had with him, he had to provide for them. But she did not have the full legal status of a wife, in that her children were not necessarily his heirs. When he passed away, the children of the concubine might or might not be taken care of in the will, just depending on what he had said. Things like that. So she was like a wife, but not completely like a wife in legal terms. Now, why would a woman become a concubine and not a wife? Well, in the case of someone like Solomon, and I want to be careful in how I say this, Solomon had the authority to do a lot of stuff, but the one thing that an Israelite man could not do, he was not allowed under the law of Moses to marry a slave in his house. You know, you'd have male and female slaves, and one of the things that God put in place was that you may not marry your slave. Well, why was that? As a means of protecting a woman who's essentially owned by a man from being forced into a relationship she didn't want. So he couldn't legally marry her, but what they did was get around it by introducing this idea of a concubine, like an official girlfriend. And that sounds disrespectful, but you understand what I'm saying. And so that's one of the reasons you have a concubine, is if you wanted to marry a slave or to have one of your slaves as someone in a relationship. Sometimes it was the result of just a woman who got involved with a married man. The word we would use is they were having an affair. And to make it, essentially give it a legal framework, she could become his concubine, in that the romantic relationship could continue but she wasn't given the full status as a wife. And so essentially it was like, sounds really terrible, but this is what it was like. It was like having a mistress for whom you were legally responsible. And so she didn't have the legal status of a wife, but he did have to provide for her needs. So those are just a couple of examples of the kind of things that were pretty common in ancient Israel, and certainly not just Israel. The Israelites learned this from the people around them, from the nations around them. Very, very common. So I've kind of given you a little bit of background. There's a lot more that I could say, and again, we may do it next week, just depending. But having given you that little bit of background, I want to ask a question and then kind of present something to you. Since God established monogamous marriage between one man and one woman as the ideal, and that's inarguable, that's clear in Scripture. Since God did that, why did he allow polygamy among his people? Because there were a lot of things, other practices that the nations around Israel did that God did not allow, right? Like there were certain things that you're not going to do this no matter what, and if you do, I'm going to judge you. Polygamy doesn't fall into that category. It wasn't something you could say was God's perfect will, and yet it was something he permitted. And he even blessed men who had multiple wives. Not because they had multiple wives, but he blessed them in spite of the fact that they're doing something that wasn't really his ideal. And so what I'm going to do now is suggest something to you that I cannot prove. Nobody can prove this because we don't know the mind of God. But I'm going to present it as a possible argument for polygamy, and then I want you to think about it as I'm talking, and then you decide if you agree. We can maybe get into a little bit in our discussion time. When I was studying the last few days, several of the Old Testament scholars that I was reading their work, they believe that this idea of polygamy and to a degree having concubines actually had to do with the vulnerability of women in the ancient world, and this was one way of providing protection for them, even if it was not under the most ideal of circumstances. Now, let me kind of give you a little bit of social background here. Throughout the ancient world, and Israel was no exception, Israel was part of this process, most people made their living through agriculture. The vast majority of people did not actually live in Jerusalem and serve as, shopkeepers or whatever. There were plenty of them, but far more people lived outside Jerusalem. They lived out on farms, on their family farm. They raised crops, they raised livestock. And farming, even today, with all the modern equipment farmers have, farming today is still hard. As you know, if you see how farmers work, it's long hours and hard work. But back then, they're doing it without tractors. They're doing it without modern machinery. They're doing it without modern irrigation systems, right? All the stuff that farmers today take for granted. Back then, it was far more demanding and far more difficult than it is today. And I'm not exaggerating when I use the phrase, when I say it was back-breaking labor. To be a farmer back then was a tough way to make a living. And what happened is people who were out working in the field, essentially, we talked about the plow systems and all those kind of things they had to do. They were often injured while doing their work. It was not uncommon for somebody to get a serious injury, and not just from the equipment they were using or the lack of equipment. If you worked with livestock, especially with cattle, with oxen and all that kind of thing, an animal that size, even if it doesn't mean to, can injure you very, very quickly. And if they want to injure you, if they mean to do it, it's much worse. And so there were just a lot of injuries and a lot of deaths. And this is still this way in many parts of the world. People who work in third world countries as farmers, it is a struggle, it is dangerous, it is a very, very hard way to make a living. So that's the first thing. We're going to kind of come back to that. Just kind of keep that in your mind. And then there were other professions that were commonplace back then that weren't necessarily directly related to agriculture, but they were also difficult and dangerous. Stonemasons didn't have the equipment that you do today. They were moving rocks. They were cutting rocks. They were moving them by hand. Things go wrong. Carpenters, like Jesus, didn't have the modern equipment we have today. Even today, carpenters still lose fingertips. You know, you've all seen that kind of thing. Back then, it was far more dangerous. They're using much more primitive tools, and injuries very, very commonplace. Even just an ordinary laborer, somebody who tried to get a job every day just doing labor. Think about what it was like in ancient Israel. It is much of the year a desert-like climate. Extremely hot. You're out there in the sun. You're working from dawn till dusk. And when you put out that kind of effort on a daily basis, it is going to take a toll on your body. It produced health problems, and the older people got, the more they suffered and struggled with the effects of labor. So all that to say this, the fact that most labor was so difficult was the reason that the vast majority of jobs in the ancient world, including Israel, were reserved for men. It was widely felt that men were better able to do that. You'd want a man getting out there and working, moving rocks and trying to corral animals and things like that. So men were more injured, were injured more often, and men died more often just in their work. Okay? Something else that affected men disproportionately had to do with military obligations. One of the things you see in the Old Testament is a lot of wars, right? All these wars taking place, Israel invading, Israel being invaded, and nations were constantly invading one another in an effort to increase the size and wealth of their territory. And so you're living in your home country. You might be suddenly called up to military service because the Philistines are coming or the Amalekites are coming, and suddenly you go from being a farmer to being a soldier because someone's got to show up, right? And if you weren't involved in defending your country from an invader, you could be drafted to be part of the army of your nation to go invade someone else. You weren't given a choice. You were drafted. And so the point is here, you got these two things going on. You've got work-related injuries and deaths being very common, particularly among men. And then you have warfare, constant warfare, resulting in permanent injuries or death. These primarily affected men. And because men were more likely to die than women, the result was oftentimes a numerical imbalance in society. There were usually fewer men in a country than women because statistically, men were more likely to have been killed. And that's one of the reasons the Old Testament, well, the New Testament too, but particularly the Old Testament, spends a lot of time talking about widows and orphans and caring for them. Not that widows and orphans don't exist in our day, they obviously do. It's simply that the percentage of widows and orphans compared to society as a whole was higher back then than it is today, percentage-wise. A lot more men, percentage-wise, were being killed. And so what did God do? He told the people of Israel they had a responsibility to provide for the needs of widows and orphans. Let me read you one passage. There's a bunch we could read. Here's one. Deuteronomy 14, verses 28 and 29. At the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all of the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up in your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, and watch this, the fatherless and the widow who are within your towns shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. Widows and orphans were rather commonplace. And of course, you know the other scriptures about, when you're bringing in your harvest, don't take everything. That which falls to the ground, leave it so the poor, the widows, and the orphans can come and gather it up. Now, here was the problem. Ancient Jewish people were like modern American people. Not every one of them did what God told them to do, right? the landowners, the farmers, they didn't necessarily follow God's commands to provide for widows and orphans. And so sometimes the result was widows and orphans fell into hardship. They suffered and they struggled. They didn't have enough. and because they had no one to help, their husband, the father, is dead. And given the women's the restrictions that women faced, which I've talked about, they weren't always able to make an adequate living because certain jobs were not open to women. It just wasn't going to happen. And so because the jobs available to women were restricted, sometimes, and it's a very sad thing, but this is the reality of history back then, these women were forced into either begging or, sadly, prostitution. Remember, the available jobs were primarily jobs that required intense physical labor. And so the vast majority of people looking to hire someone would have been looking for men to do hard work. And so, all that to say this, some of the Old Testament scholars, and this is where, again, we're speculating, we don't know. But they have speculated or suggested that polygamy, or this idea of having concubines, might have been one way of addressing this situation where you've got women without a husband or a father to provide for them. They were struggling to make ends meet. And so the fact that a man could have more than one wife might have been a way to deal with the fact that there was almost always fewer available men than women. Now, as we conclude and we go into discussion, I want to go back to what I said earlier. From the beginning, polygamy was never part of God's plan for human marriage. But of course, we know that, right? When you read the story of Adam and Eve, it was a monogamous marriage, one couple in a monogamous relationship. That's what God wanted. But what happened? Sin entered the picture, right? Genesis. Sin enters the picture and everything changes. And so much of what God had intended for mankind suffered or was twisted as a result, right? And eventually situations come into human existence. God never intended divorce. That came in. God never intended slavery. That came in. All kinds of things that we've seen in the Bible and we're still dealing with to this day. None of these were part of God's original plan, but they came into existence because sin entered the world. And so the idea here, if this perspective is true, this idea of polygamy, as much as we look at it, think that's a terrible thing. And of course, it's illegal in our country, right? But it could have been God's way of providing, not his ideal will, but providing for the needs of vulnerable women and children, making the best of a bad situation. And honestly, if you think about it, that's kind of still, not polygamy, but the making the best of a bad situation. That's kind of what God still has to deal with today with people, right? Because we're still sinful. Even followers of Jesus, even those of you that love the Lord, you're Christians, you struggle with sin every day. I struggle with sin every day. And that means God doesn't have any perfect people to deal with. He's got us, right? And so in his grace, he doesn't wait till we become perfect before he blesses us, right? He works with us where we're at. And someday his kingdom will be established in its fullness. All things will be made right. But until then, here we are in all of our flaws and all of our failures, and yet God still works with us and helps us. So I am not endorsing polygamy. I'm going to say that for YouTube. Our church does not endorse polygamy. And I'm not saying that this is what God had in mind. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's a possibility worth considering. So time for me to stop talking and time for you guys to give your opinions, because I think this could be very, very interesting.